2, 3, A, radius, gauge. Hey everybody, Matt Aaron, American Buhurt, here for the Armed Academy of Arizona. And all silliness aside, I have a subject that I can get obnoxiously passionate about, and that is reading a radius gauge properly. I've had the unfortunate, the misfortune of encountering a number of people over the past several years in the Buhurt space who should know how to read a radius gauge, but didn't know how to read a radius gauge. Yeah. Not to belabor that point too much, I figured this would be a great opportunity to mitigate those problems. So if I'm not willing to be part of the solution, then I should just shut up. So here I am, being a part of the solution. I have in my hand an IMCF style radius gauge. These all work very similarly. You'll find radius gauges in a number of different shapes, sizes, and formats. You'll see them 3D printed out of plastic. You'll see them laser or water jet cut. This one's one of mine. You can get those laser cut. And so I have my gauge. I have a couple of example weapons, and I have this handy dandy chart that I drew up that I'm going to go over with you here in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and take you off the tripod and bring you over here. First, ignore that. We're going to talk about the gauge itself first. So this is an IMCF Marshall's gauge. It has a number of different gauges built into it, but they all work very similarly. They have the 3 radius cutouts on 3 sides. These are internal radius gauges. And then we have one external radius gauge, and these will come in different radiuses. So in this case, it's 10 millimeter cutout for single-handed weapons, like swords and sword tips. This is for the non-striking surface. We have our 15 millimeter cutout for two-handed weapons and their non-striking surfaces. We have a 35 millimeter radius cutout for, I forget what this is for, but we have it. And we have a 50 millimeter external gauge for your two-handed weapon striking surface radius. And then we also have this nice little cute little 2 millimeter cutout for your edges. So we're gonna go over how to read all of those today here in a minute. But first, let me show you this graph, these charts that I drew. So quick review, an internal radius gauge, you're gonna take whatever radius is appropriate to be measuring for the weapon that you're doing. That's mistake number one a lot of people make, is they use the wrong cutout. So look at the rules, read them again, and pick the right cutout for what you're trying to measure. Again, this changes from tournament to tournament, from marshal to marshal, and I've seen instances of 2 different marshals at the same tournament using two different radiuses to check the same weapons for the specs. So again, read the rules. Know which one of these you need to use for what. They are subject to change, however, so I'm not going to go into details about what these are specifically for. I'm just going to go into the operation of the gauge. Then we have our external radius gauge, which you will put over your weapon. You'll put it over the edge of your weapon, and you'll measure. And you'll basically use this as do I have enough weapon poking out around this thing to make sure it's not too sharp. So again, we'll go ahead and we'll move over to my drawings here for clarity. So I have a few examples. So for your internal gauge, imagine this thing is sitting on top of your weapon at this point. So boop, your weapon is the black, you're sitting this on top. And you have, if you fill up this whole cavity, chances are you have a pretty good chance of passing here. Well, not a pretty good chance, you are passing reg, you are passing spec. There are a couple of fudge factors to this, so once you get full, you'll start seeing things like swords and stuff start filling the gauge, and then when you get to the more competitive side of things, you'll start to see stuff like this start to happen, or you'll see people making weapons with aesthetics in mind first and then spec in mind second, and then you'll get stuff that's extremely sharp. You'll find you'll have a lot of air gap between these two corners, and at that point your weapon is too sharp. You're going to have to grind a lot off to get that thing to pass spec. You might end up losing a lot of length. That being said, there is some wiggle room with air gapping on the side of this gauge, but that ultimately is up to your marshal to decide if you have enough width at that point. But chances are, if you're only contacting the gauge at a very singular point, right up at the tippy top, weapon's too sharp, gotta go grind it down. For the external gauge, you're gonna again do this, you're gonna place this on top. Gauge usually goes on top, unless you're doing something different that I'm not familiar with, but with the gauge on top, you'll set the gauge down over your striking edge. If you bump one of these, if you just bump it up to a point and you see weapon edge on either side, you are good to go. Your weapon is not too sharp. If you start moving down here, this is where again you get into some of the wiggle room that depends on what marshal you've got. You can have your minimum radius and then it can taper off if the non-striking surfaces are the minimum cutting length, your edge is long enough, you've passed your minimum edge length spec, and these corners meet whatever internal, whatever non-striking radius spec is set for that weapon. Once you get into stuff like this where your gauge is on top and you can't see your weapon anymore, chances are very good it is not a passing weapon. If you sink the gauge underneath and you see it looking like this graph above, but with the gauge underneath, with that 50 millimeter edge, chances are too sharp. You're gonna have to go and do some modifications to get that thing to pass. So unfortunately, I don't have anything that doesn't pass. I don't have a habit of making things outside of spec, and this is why I've had some rather, again, I'll say passionate discussions with marshals, refs, and other people about how to do this properly. So we're gonna have to use our imagination on one of these, and maybe I'll use one of the wrong cutouts to kind of give you an example of an incorrect or non-passing weapon. So I have here two-handed axe. Again, you're probably very familiar with this shape. This is one of those nice little heat seekers that are oh so popular today, but this is a good chance for me to show you what is passing on both an external radius gauge, this one, and an internal radius gauge, one of these ones. So for IMCF, ACS, ACW, that kind of rule set, your non-striking surfaces for a two-handed weapon should be, at last I checked, 15 millimeters radius or greater. So if you have a big fat lump over here, that's fine. You just don't want this any sharper than 15 millimeters. Another thing that people get in trouble with is they have a non-striking surface, but the axe head is tilted so far that it now becomes a striking surface. When I marshal tournaments, I see this all the time. I haven't been to many lately, but this kind of is sort of skirting the rules a little bit, and if it tilts too far, that corner becomes a striking surface, and if it's a two-hander, or even if it's not, in some cases, this can make your weapon not pass. So make sure that your striking surfaces are all actually striking surfaces, and not you're not trying to sneak non-striking surfaces in there. So I'm belaboring the point. To check this point with a radius gauge, I'm going to take the gauge, I'm going to pop it right on there, and if you will see, there is minimal amount of light coming through that gauge. Again, this is kind of trying to get this to focus, but you can see that fills up actually in this case, it fills up more than is available in this radius. And so therefore I have a 15 millimeter radius all the way up tangent to my striking edge and the top of my axe. So this is what it looks like when you have a good passing axe. Or yeah, in this case, yeah, it's an axe. But, so for the external gauge, this is basically just to make sure that your striking surface doesn't become a striking point. You'll take that same gauge, and you'll lay it over. Kind of hard to tell with the, let's see if I can get it to focus a little closer. There we go, that'll work. Maybe I'll come back and redo this one. But what you'll do is you'll bump this corner up, boop, to the edge. And if you see your edge is peeking over, this is a greater radius than 50 millimeters. So if you have a smaller radius, your circle gets smaller, the radius gets tighter, the corner essentially gets pointier. Now, if you were to have something, say, that is not 50 millimeters, so like let's say, again, this is why when you tilt these axes forward super far on the haft, they don't technically pass. Because if I put this up here, I am now missing all of my, there is no axe here. Or there is, yeah, so you can kind of see this is now too sharp. Especially like, imagine you're mounted this way, so yeah, too sharp. Perfect. Okay, forgive the technical difficulties there and all the jumping around, but I have here, now this is gonna be my example of a not passing weapon. Like I said earlier, I don't have anything that doesn't pass, so I'm gonna have to kind of cheat this a little bit by using a larger radius to illustrate my point. So I have here one of my long swords. This is one of our Sentinels that I work with Krieger Armory to make. This is actually one of the very first prototypes. So let me see if I can get a good angle here. Perfect. Boop, right there, clamp that in place. Awesome. So, see if I can zoom in just a little bit. Yeah, that'll work. So I'm gonna use the 35 millimeter cutout to illustrate my point. If your point sits inside your gauge and you see there's a very small contact patch here with a bunch of air surfacing, with a bunch of air around the point, this would be indicative that your weapon is too sharp. This is a gross exaggeration, because this is indeed a passing weapon. However, to illustrate the point, this is the kind of thing you're looking for. Now, if you look at my fingers and my hands, you can see that that point comes to essentially contact that gauge at one point. This is not a good weapon. Sorry for the technical difficulties there, folks. We're gonna go ahead and touch really quick on how you work your edge measurement tool, and then I'll go ahead into set up into some physical examples for you so you can get an idea what that looks like. So if your edge is wide enough to not even sit in this slot, good to go. If you decide to go towards minimum spec and your edge just barely sinks in there, chances are you're also good to go. When you get to the point where your edge is actually sinking in to this gauge more than just a tiny little hair of a bit, it is no longer legal. You'll find this happening when you have chips in the blade, or if you've made the mistake of purchasing something prematurely without checking if it's a reputable seller who's familiar with specs, or if you're trying to press gang something that's not built for Buhurt into service. So at this point, you're gonna have to either start grinding down your edges to dull them out till it doesn't sink into this little channel anymore, or you're gonna have to find another weapon. Them's just the breaks. So yeah, that's enough of me drawing about this with graphs and drawings that may or may not give you some sort of clarity. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna switch positions one more time. I'll give you examples of what I'm talking about here. I'll actually have my axe over here, and then I have a long sword or a messer or something sitting around over here that I can kind of give you an example of what a failing weapon might look like. So stand by. Okay, lastly, checking your edge. You're gonna take that 2 millimeter cutout, and take the edge of your weapon, and you're gonna put that thing on that edge, and you're gonna run it all the way down. This obviously passes. I can't even get this anywhere near inside this gauge. Not gonna fit. No way, no how. A little bit more of a, that's too big. Well, we'll just skip straight to the failing example. This is not a Buhurt messer. This is for HEMA. They don't have the same rules we do, but this gives me a very good opportunity to illustrate my point. This is almost legal for Buhurt. The thing that makes it not legal is that I have ground this thing with a hollow grind, and so it is very thin. This is pretty much exactly 2 millimeters, but maybe a little bit less, and it's 2 millimeters and it's too thin for too far. You can see I can get this thing all the way in there. My general rule of thumb, oh hey, there we go. Now that we're getting back towards the ricasso, this is actually passing. It's kind of hard to see at this angle, but I'm gonna see if I can get you in there a little tighter. Here we go. Passing, bare minimum, just barely above 2 millimeters. Go about an inch forward, inch or two forward, no longer passing, no good. Even if it were to sink this far into this gauge, this would be considered a non-passing weapon. Again, passing, not passing, passing, not passing. I hope that illustrates my point. And again, I am not looking to, I'm gonna scooch you back here because I want to look at your beautiful virtual faces and talk to you sincerely. I'm not doing this to call out any one particular person. I have just, as I said, had experiences in the past where I am very pedantic about making things to spec. And it's very difficult to make things to spec if the proper educational materials to follow that spec are not in place. So that is why I'm doing this video today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out either via American Buhurt or to the Armored Academy. We'll be happy to set you straight on how to read one of these properly. Again, this is something that I can get incredibly pedantic about, but it is important for the longevity and the safety of the sport. I realize that rules change. I realize that specs change, but being able to understand those specs is vitally important, especially as somebody who makes and produces these sorts of things for a living. And so, naturally, my hairs get up. But that being said, thank you for sticking with us for this long. I hope it was informative. And you guys fight safe and yeah, go do some Buhurt.